Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Brian Judge, and I'm the director of the Berkeley Program on Finance and Democracy, a new research group here within the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative and the Social Science Matrix that studies how finance can be made more democratic. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to What Do the Rich Owe the Rest of Us, a conversation on taxation and democracy. And so I'm here to introduce today's moderator, Aaron Horvath. So Aaron is a sociologist focused on the complex relationship between immense private wealth, philanthropy in particular, and the social underpinnings of democracy. His work explores philanthropy's influence over popular conceptions of the common good, how the fetishization of metrics and quantification has transformed the civic imagination, and the social implications of digitally intermediated community life. His writing has appeared in numerous outlets, including the American Journal of Sociology, the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Organization Studies, and the Hedgehog Review. His ideas on philanthropy, nonprofits, tech wealth, and oligarchy have been cited in popular outlets like The Atlantic, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Wired. Building on his work at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, he is the founder and co-director of Private Wealth and the Public Good, a multidisciplinary research initiative that counteracts the civic dysfunctions of past philanthropic paradigms and critically examines alternatives for leveraging philanthropic resources to build civic capacity and build democratic infrastructure. So to learn more, please visit bezi.berkeley.edu, matrix.berkeley.edu, and pwpg.org. So without further ado, Aaron Horvath.
Different to me, but I'm glad it sounds different to y'all. Yeah, it's cool to see so many people out to talk about taxes. In a January 2025 interview with Ross Douthat, the billionaire venture capitalist Mark Andreessen described what he called a deal with a capital D, an unwritten understanding between ultra-wealthy people like himself and the rest of society. As he put it, the goal for people like him was to start a company, make a lot of money, and then that company itself would be good because it's bringing a new technology into the world, and that makes the world a better place to him. But then you also make a lot of money, and you give that money away, and through that, you absolve yourself of all your sins. Andreessen goes on in the interview to complain that this deal, which presumably few of us remember agreeing to, has collapsed because society, and not billionaires, has become radicalized, ungrateful, and unreasonable. So for anyone paying attention over the past few decades, and especially over the past few years, it should be obvious who's actually reneged on the social contract. While many of us struggle to pay for healthcare or to make rent, the ultra-rich have accumulated staggering fortunes, all while shedding any pretense of public obligation. Today's super-rich shamelessly evade taxes and civic responsibility. Their claims of serving the public have grown indistinguishable from their self-interested pursuits. It's almost as if Musk's trillion-dollar payday were a signal of humanity's great progress. And as the proposed California billionaire tax demonstrates, the mere suggestion that billionaires contribute just a little bit more to the public good is enough to cause a fit. At the same time that we're having all this left-right polarization, many of us are increasingly worried about polarization of a different sort, top versus bottom. In fact, to quote Warren Buffett, it's a class war, and my class is winning. And if we're unwilling to remain spectators to this perversion of democracy, it's important that we begin asking these questions like, what do the rich owe the rest of us? And further, how can we hold them accountable to the public good? So to explore these questions, my organization, Private Wealth and the Public Good, along with the Economic Security Project and, of course, the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, have organized a panel that takes up these issues through the lens of taxation. And as you've probably realized, and probably a good reason why you're here, it's quite the panel. First, to my left, we have Vanessa Williamson, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Price of Democracy, Revolutionary Power of Taxation in American History. And she'll kick us off with a deep historical context on the all too often overlooked relationship between taxation and democracy. Then we'll have Ray Madoff, professor of law at Boston College and author of The Second Estate, How the Tax Code Made an American Aristocracy. And she'll help us to understand how our antiquated tax code has ceased to be a tool for redistribution and instead has become an instrument for dynastic accumulation. Next, we have Emmanuel Saez, professor of economics at UC Berkeley and co-author of Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay, and who also helped design the California billionaire tax. And he'll speak on the economics of taxing the ultra wealthy, what the data tell us, and what all this means for designing tax policies. And finally, we have Brian Galle, professor of law at UC Berkeley and author of How to Tax the Ultra Rich, which I believe is just out as of January, who also helped write the billionaire tax proposal. And he'll discuss the legal and practical considerations of taxing wealth at the federal and state level. So we'll begin with each panelist speaking for about 7 to 10 minutes. And then we'll engage in a moderated discussion before opening up to audience questions. I haven't really looked at it, but I think over my head there is a QR code. So if you are interested in asking questions, that's the ticket to doing it. So get those in, and then we'll try to get to those questions in the last half hour or so. So thanks for being here, and Vanessa.
Having me. I'm so excited to be back in Berkeley. I want to start by telling you a story. It is December 16th, 1773.
Your mic.
Oh, is it not working? It is on, supposedly. Is it working? Okay. So, even, how about that? No, it doesn't make any, you can hear me. I don't know. Can the people in the back, can you hear me? You're okay. All right, I think it is on, but I can also just project. It's okay. All right, so let me tell you a story. It's December 16th, it's 1773. It is a cold winter night in Boston, Massachusetts, and mechanics and artisans are making their way to Griffin's Wharf. Some are dressed as Mohawk Indians. Others are wearing women's gowns, and many have covered their face with soot to disguise themselves. And over the course of that evening, they would board 3 ships in the harbor and throw 90,000 pounds of cargo into the water. That cargo was, of course, British tea. Now, you'll all have recognized this story as the story of the Boston Tea Party. Why were the colonists so angry? Now, it's possible that a couple of people in this room know the answer to this one, but if you ask the average American, they will tell you that, of course, Americans were very angry because taxes were too high. But the reality of what actually happened in 1773 is that mechanics and artisans threw tea in the harbor to protest taxes that were too low. Yes, they were very angry about a corporate tax cut being offered to the East India Company, which was a corporation that was deeply embedded with Parliament. It was basically the face of the British Empire. It controlled much of India. And despite that, they had managed to get themselves into financial trouble with some speculation and a bubble that had popped. And so now this company, this corporation is floundering. Well, Parliament thought it was too big to fail. And so they offered a big bailout to the East India Company. And as part of that bailout, they gave the East India Company a special break on their taxes for the tea that they sold in the colonies. And so even though the result of this bailout was going to be that tea was cheaper in Boston, the American colonists were very angry. As Samuel Adams put it, he was the leader of the Sons of Liberty, the group that boarded those ships and took on the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Sam Adams said that the problem with the legislation was that it was introductive of monopolies and therefore a threat to public liberty. So I tell you this story partly because I want more people to know it. I think it's really interesting. But I also tell it because so commonly the Tea Party has been a touchstone for sort of hand-wavy argument about how Americans just hate taxes. And the reason that we can't tax, for example, the wealthy, the reason that our public schools are underfunded, or the reason that various things are not working in our society, well, you can't do anything about it because what the problem is that Americans hate taxes. People always point to the Boston Tea Party when they're telling this story. Now, I wrote a book on the history of taxation in America, and I wanted to understand, what actually drew me to do this work was exactly that question. I wanted to understand if the kind of anti-tax rhetoric you hear now, right, and so the long post-Reagan era, is that level of anti-tax sentiment at an elite level, is that normal? Are we always this angry about taxes? Are we always, is there always a political party that discusses taxation in terms of sort of good and evil and tyranny, right? And the answer, of course, is no, right? Much as the story of the Boston Tea Party, most people have heard wrong. The idea that Americans hate taxes is also equally wrong and in fact backwards. Now, it's not to say we never fight about taxes. We do. We are fighting about them in the contemporary era, of course. But in the mid-20th century, we weren't. Taxes were not a major part of either political party's platform. They were a pretty minor issue. They were like other issues, right? When do we fight about taxes? Well, it's when we're fighting about who is included in we the people, right? When we're fighting about who gets to be part of America, that's when we fight about taxes the way we've been fighting about it in recent decades, right? This is part of the long reaction in the contemporary era to the civil rights movement. But we fought about taxes the way we fight about them now in previous periods, right? There's a recurring problem in American history, which is that when suffrage has expanded in some significant way, it provokes a reaction on the part of a portion of the wealthy who are suddenly very concerned that this new broader public will tax them, right? So this has happened again and again. And the problem is that the wealthy tend to react to that fear of taxation by the masses by doing two things. One, they undermine democratic institutions. And two, they undermine the capacity of the government to tax. I'll tell you very briefly about a couple of times that are like the time we're living in now in that way, right? In that there is an anti-tax movement that is undermining democratic practices. So the first one occurred during while we were putting together the Constitution. And as, of course, you will all know, slave owners demanded a distortion to representation. They demanded the 3/5 clause, that they would be able to have expanded representation because they would count people they enslaved for the purposes of allocating House seats. So the 3/5 clause. In this room, people will also know the direct tax clause, right? Which was also a part of that compromise with the slaveholding South and limited the capacity of the federal government to tax. Because all across the South, in the slaveholder class, there was a fear that the new, more powerful federal government, even though suffrage was limited only to propertied white men, that new, more powerful federal government, with a suffrage that included a majority of people who were non-slave owners, they would tax slavery out of existence. They would achieve abolition through taxation. And so people like Patrick Henry opposed the Constitution specifically on that grounds, that the Constitution would allow the abolitionists to free enslaved people, right? We saw the same kind of rhetoric again in the period of Reconstruction, right? The brief experiment with multiracial democracy in the American South, when former Confederates continued fighting the war by new means. They, obviously engaged in a campaign of white supremacist terror to overthrow the Southern democratically elected governments of the American South. But they also organized as taxpayers. They're taxpayer leagues. They were kind of the respectable front groups for things like the red shirts and the white leagues. And these organizations, one, engaged in a tax strike that undermined the fiscal capacity of the southern states, and two, it was a very appealing rhetoric for Northerners of the era, because in the North, in the northern cities, they were also fighting about who is we the people, and can we trust those people with the tax money? I'm not sure that we can. Northern industrialists in New York City, for example, tried to reverse universal male suffrage in 1877 and institute instead a very high taxpayer standard to vote in for a new board of finance that would have all the powers of the municipal government. It was a way, they hoped, that they could seize back the power, the fiscal power, from the immigrant industrial classes that were talking about things like unions and talking about things like public investments. So again and again throughout our history, we've seen anti-democratic forces organize themselves very explicitly as an anti-tax movement and engage in this two-pronged strategy to undermine electoral systems and to undermine the tax capacity of the state. Obviously, we can talk about how that fits in the contemporary moment, but I want to leave it to my panelists, to my fellow panelists, to talk more about now. But I'll leave this. So what I'm telling you good news? Well, hard to say, right? On the one hand, this recurring history of attempts to institute authoritarian regimes in the United States, we've had more than one. That recurring history, the power of the wealthy to respond to suffrage expansions with efforts to limit democracy and to limit the capacity of the state to tax, that recurring history is sort of depressing, right? But it's a lot better, I think, than the idea that Americans hate taxes. Because if the problem were the hearts and minds of the American people, I don't understand how you'd win. But if you recognize the problem the way I think is the right way to understand it historically, I think there's a lot more room to maneuver and, frankly, to win. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to be at Berkeley. It's great to be with these amazing panelists on this most important topic at this most critical moment. So nobody is distracted, in case anyone's wondering, not related. A little gift from Ellis Island to the Medyevs and Megadowskis. I want to pick up also on a little bit of history, and I'm also talking about my book, which I foolishly forgot to bring, but it's called The Second Estate: How the Tax Code Made an American Aristocracy. And again, some people might think like Second Estate, what is that? The press is the Fourth Estate. The Second Estate was the aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France. And under the law of the time, they were specifically written out of the tax system. And what I argue in my book is that this is where we are today. Basically, that we have legally written the wealthiest Americans out of our tax system. And what I want to talk about is how we got here, how we got to this place, because, of course, by appearance, our system does the exact opposite, right? By appearance, we have progressive income taxes. We have additional estate taxes. And so, like, what does that mean when you say that the rich aren't paying taxes? So I want to tell a little bit of backstory and talk about how it is that the wealthy came to write themselves out of the tax system, and whether it matters and what can be done about it. And of course, wealth taxes comes right out of this story, right out of a sense of perceived failure of our current system. Okay, so a little bit back in time. I'm not going quite as far back as the 1700s. I want to go back to the Gilded Age, an era that was in some ways much like our own, right? We had really for the first time in this country, tremendous concentrations of wealth, tremendous wealth inequality, right? So lots of people with very little money, and then big concentrations of wealth at the top. And at the turn of that century, at the turn of the 20th century, the taxes that we had in place to be real back to the future was tariffs, right? The President Trump's favorite, we had President McKinley, we had tariffs, and tariffs were, that's pretty much what we had to raise revenue for the country. The problem with tariffs is that they were tremendously burdensome to farmers and consumers who, as we know, bore the costs of these increased prices. And what's interesting is that the increased prices came not just from foreign imports, but also from domestic producers who now no longer had competition and so could raise their prices. So everybody was raising prices from the tariffs, and it hurt everybody. Meanwhile, we had these people running around literally wearing crowns on their heads. So there's a wonderful picture of Cornelia, Vanderbilt. Cornelia Vanderbilt, she was wearing a crown, and they were, of course, all being married to get titles, right? Our Constitution doesn't allow titles, but if you married abroad, you could bring back a title. They had lavish parties, kind of like our people today, right? Lavish parties with cigars wrapped in $100 bills, elephants, all this. And this was all very public because it was a time of conspicuous consumption, right? And so the way the elite showed their elite is they did these things all very publicly. It wasn't the time of stealth wealth, which is sort of a little bit of what we have now, right? Where super rich people are wearing hoodies and smoking joints with Joe Rogan and all sorts of stuff. They were like top hats, tiaras, the whole thing. And there was a lot of concern that the United States had lost its way because we were an egalitarian country of farmers and this and that, and all of a sudden we had all these rich people. And adding to the concern was the threat of socialism. And indeed, President McKinley was killed by an anarchist, right, advocating for socialism. So socialism was a real threat, which caused a lot of people to think that capitalism had to prove itself to the public. And the way it could prove itself to the public was through a new tax system. And the new tax system was an income tax system. We got the constitutional amendment to bring back the income tax in 1913. That originally only applied to the richest Americans, but even as it expanded over the course of the 20th century, it still retained its progressive tax rate so that those who earned more paid more, right? So we had this broad-based income tax system that was geared to those with the most income. And then we had, quickly following after that in 1916, we had an estate tax that imposed taxes at pretty significant rates on all transfers at death. And then in 1924, we added a gift tax so that people didn't avoid the estate tax by the gift tax rate. And this is what we had throughout much of the 20th century. And so somebody who had somebody who was very rich typically had a very high salary. Then they got a lot of dividends on their stock. And then they had this inheritance, this estate tax that was imposed. It was a fairly robust system. It did have its flaws. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was a system that was kind of regularly maintained. Okay. However, today, we arguably still have that system, right? In some ways, rates have come down, but we still have progressive income tax rates. We still have an estate tax. But what I argue in my book is that, in fact, while we have this system in place, the wealthy have been able to sneak out the back door. And they do so by following what I call the tax avoidance playbook. And the 3 steps of the tax avoidance playbook are avoid salaries, avoid dividends, and then sales, and inherit wealth, which has become even better than it sounds. So I just want to quickly, I know time is, I don't want to take too much time, but how do they do these things? So the first thing is avoid salaries. If you look at our richest Americans, these people are making nothing. They're making so little that Elon Musk, the California Fair Labor people, came after Tesla to say, like, what's up? You're not paying this guy even minimum wage, right? So these guys are all like $1 a year guys. Bezos made $82,000, but don't worry, he was able to get the child care tax credit. So that reduced his tax liability on his $82,000. Like, none of these people are taking salaries. And of course, the reason that they're not taking salaries is because salaries are for suckers. People who earn salaries are paying all of the taxes of the country. Between the income taxes and the payroll taxes, 84% of the taxes are really coming from people who are paid salaries. Just to get a little sense, moderate people, somebody who makes $60,000, which was the average income fairly recently, right? In California, somebody who's like an independent contractor of some sort making $60,000 pays $15,000 in taxes. That really makes a significant impact on somebody who's trying to get by on $60,000. Meanwhile, we have our billionaires with $60 billion, $600 billion, and they are able to avoid taxes. So first of all, they avoid salaries. What about dividends? Dividends used to be the only way that companies could share profits with their shareholders, right? And then in 1982, there was a little known change in the SEC rules that for the first time allowed companies to go out and buy back their own stock. The effect of that is that when you buy back stock, basically it drives up the price for the people who are the remaining stockholders, because you're taking out some shareholders, you retain the same amount, and so basically it drives up the price of stock. Stock buybacks are huge. They're huge amongst our tech billionaires, and just past year, in 2025, there was $1 trillion of stock buybacks. Okay, so basically stock buybacks allow people to enjoy tax-free growth of their assets by not selling their assets. Well, what about when they sell their assets? Don't they have to sell their assets to pay for their lavish weddings and houses and all of that? And as many of you probably have heard, they don't sell. What do? Borrow. They borrow against it, okay? They basically use their assets for collateral, and they borrow, and by borrowing, they have tax-free access to their wealth because that is not treated as a taxable event. Okay, the third thing, inheriting wealth. don't we have an estate tax? Isn't that an unfair double tax that hurts family farms and businesses, right? The problem is that in 1990, there was a campaign against the estate tax funded by 18 of the country's richest families. And the effect of that campaign was for 1 year, we had no estate tax at all, right? We called it, I teach estate planning, we called it the throw mama from the train year, right? Every year, gifts to give your parents or grandparents, warm chicken salad, hang gliding lessons. It was a time for great jokes in our area. So that was one aspect of it. But there was a more significant effect, which is that since 1990, there has not been a single loophole closed in the estate tax. So we are operating under a system for the past 35, 36 years. My students, other people have been working out all sorts of ways to avoid estate taxes, grats, clots, scrats, Q-perts, Q-tips, slats, slants, right? We've come up with all sorts of really cutesy names for no one is paying the estate tax anymore. So it is a big problem. The estate tax is hardly raising anything. Does it make a difference? Some say, The Economist just ran an article saying like, oh, we're already taxing the rich, and anyway, there aren't enough fat cats around to support the thing. Okay, I want to give you some numbers quickly. 2025, our most recent year, the country raised about $5 trillion from all sources: corporate taxes, individual income taxes, payroll taxes, estate taxes, all the sources of income. Okay, ready? This is a numbers part. 5 trillion. We spent about 6.8 trillion, so we had to add 1.8 trillion, right? A little less than 2 trillion to the deficit. Guess how much wealth the richest 1% owned in 2025? Any numbers, guesses here? Throw it out. We had a deficit of a little under 2 trillion. The richest 1% owned $50 trillion. $50 trillion. And by the way, since then it's gone up to 55 trillion, just since the end of 2025. Okay, massive amounts of wealth. I think it matters if these people pay taxes or not, which of course brings us to wealth taxes, right? We're not taxing the income. How about wealth taxes? California has this wealth tax proposal. I myself have other proposals instead, which are for a couple of reasons. One is on the federal level. Wealth taxes are, there's quite a good chance, because of reasons that Vanessa was talking about, that wealth taxes could be found as to be an unconstitutional direct tax, particularly given our current Supreme Court. They've already kind of had a chance to say, no, that's not the case, and they kind of instead said it could be the case. So I worry that if we push for a wealth tax, which would take a lot of political capital on the federal level, it's going to then be found unconstitutional, and we're going to be nowhere. I think that we could still get at the gains. The issue is to tax investment gains. Canada taxes these gains whenever property is transferred, either during life or at death. And either by not just by sale, but by gift as well. So if you give away the property, then you're going to pay tax on all this gain. I think we should have that rule here. And then I think we also have to recognize that our estate tax is no longer doing what we think it should be doing, and we need to get rid of it, and we should just tax inheritances in the income tax system. It's the same way as we have, if you find money on the street, you're supposed to pay taxes on it. If somebody hands you $10 billion, you should pay taxes on it. We could have an exemption for inherited wealth, because increasingly lots of Americans depend on inherited wealth to help their kids buy a house or even get the most basics of a middle-class lifestyle. So we could decide, like, we're going to preference inherited wealth, $1 million, $2 million a person, some amount, but recognize it's a preference for inherited wealth, and then tax everything else as ordinary income. All right, I think I am done, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Right. So let me say a few words on taxing the rich, and the evolution of inequality. So I've done, a lot of work putting together data on inequality, the taxes the rich are paying, and how would I summarize, the findings we have? I think the most powerful summary is to say, that societies choose the level of inequality they have, and they do that precisely by setting public policy and first and front, the tax policy, and also by regulating the way we can accumulate wealth. So coming back, to the history and echoing what Ray and Vanessa said, if you look at countries, at the turn of the 20th century, so 125 years ago, you can't find a single country that has a low level of inequality. By today's standards, all the countries that have been studied have very high levels of inequality. That's true in pure autocracies. And that's also true in democracies, except that the democracies, most of them are very imperfect, in the sense that what Vanessa was saying, for the US, it's not so much one person, one vote, but it's $1 paid in taxes, one vote. Sweden is perhaps the most striking example, where it's not a poll tax on who can vote, it's literally your votes are proportional to the taxes you pay. And as those countries evolve, towards more real democracies, that's when they start instituting, much more progressive policy and government programs that are going to help, a much broader segment of society, particularly through education, health, and retirement programs. So in terms of the numbers, I want to reemphasize what Vanessa said. America is not the first country that develops, institutes a progressive income tax, or as Ray said, in 1913, that's when it started, but it's the first country who decides to crank up the numbers in terms of the level of taxation to numbers that were totally unimaginable when the first taxes, when those first taxes were introduced. So, for example, during World War I, just a few years after the federal tax is introduced, the top tax rate goes up from 6% to over 70% to fund World War I. There is an excess tax on profits. No country had ever done something like that. It probably owes a lot to the fact that America was one of the best democracies in terms of the width, of the franchise, and of course the shock of the war. And then, as Ray described, the US puts in place the most powerful progressive tax we've ever seen, with the income tax, the estate tax she described, and a big one that wasn't mentioned is actually the corporate tax on profits, taking, at source right there, about half of the profits that any of those big businesses were making. And so the US develops progressive taxation, in the middle of the 20th century, and also exports that product, around the world. Germany, Japan, under US occupation, are given effectively, are forced to adopt, the type of progressive taxes the US had, and European countries follow through. And that middle of the 20th century is perhaps gives me, optimism about humanity, because it's the time where societies put in place, structures with progressive taxation, much more equality programs that support the majority, and they do it at a time, with a miraculous economic growth, really economic growth, and it's in part reconstruction from the war, but it is an example where for some decades, economic growth could go along with more equality. Then that model somehow hits problem in the 70s with the oil shocks, inflation shocks, etc. There is less enthusiasm about that model, and that time is exploited indeed, by more right-wing politicians, Reagan and Thatcher, being the two key examples, and they are going to undermine that model. And in the US, the way it works is first you have to weaken enforcement. Some of you may remember the 80s, the early 80s, as the time where you could have partnerships, making losses to reduce your income tax. And they become so widespread. You see it in the data. It's really astonishing. And then Reagan can come in and say, look, we can't really tax the rich. They avoid taxes. Let's cut the top tax rates because those no longer work. So it works in 2 steps like this. We've seen it more recently, for the corporate tax, under the Trump administration. They finally, the US, they succeed, in cutting corporate taxes drastically from 35% to 21%. And so how do we deal with that situation? I think, that demise of progressive taxation that we've seen can be reversed. And how do you reverse it? I mean, you take at heart, the lessons from history, but it has to start with a stronger enforcement. That is, you need to be able to have in place a system that enforces taxes. And indeed, the Biden administration, perhaps their biggest achievement was to give a lot of funding for the IRS. They also gave a lot of funding, for energy transition. The problem is that then Trump came in and he destroyed exactly those 2. But that's where the fight has to start. And I want to give you, a couple examples for being more optimistic, seeing things where things are moving. One is that the world tried to get to an agreement, to have a minimum tax on corporate profits of multinationals. It's something that was negotiated under the Biden administration, was signed, by 130 countries. It's not clear what's going to happen with the Trump administration. It's possible that thing is not really going to be able to survive, but it's an example of countries coming together and deciding, look, we can't let the biggest businesses avoid taxes through tax haven. Another one that's very impressive in the sense that it was US leadership that made it possible was forcing financial institutions around the world to send information to countries about the financial accounts they have, for wealthy individuals who say use, Swiss banks. That was called FATCA in the US. That was an Obama administration law, and that was followed by countries saying, look, the US is doing this, we also want this system. And so the world has effectively moved to a system. Students here, in this room have studied that, where now if you have a foreign account, chances are very strong that actually the information on those foreign accounts is being reported, to your home country, making it much more difficult to evade. And the last optimistic point before I let Brian tell us more about it, is that we still have a democracy where it's more like one person, one vote. The billionaires, they have influence because they can give a lot to campaigns. There, it's $1. As Erin mentioned, you can leverage your dollars, but in the end, at the ballot box, it's still one person, one vote. And that's where, the California billionaire tax experiment is, after various attempts, through federal presidential campaigns, other countries, state legislatures, none of those succeeded. Because, and in part because billionaires have enormous influence, especially, in parliamentary systems to lobby lawmakers. We think a direct vote is perhaps the best way to see whether, that second Gilded Age has run its course, the people are finally rebelling against it, or whether we're going to keep going for a while. It happens, in the place that has the highest billionaire concentration we've ever seen, in part fueled, by this AI boom. It's not ideal, the billionaires can leave the state. We've tried to design it to make it difficult, for them to do so and avoid the tax. But more important, I think it's going to be an example for the world. California is known for leading key products, and it's in the tradition of U.S. democracy of inventing progressive tax. Thank you.
Both my fellow panelists, can people hear me? Yeah, great. So I'm going to tell a story about the history that we just heard. It's not just a history of democracy and taxes, it's also a story of technological change in taxes. And tax systems are technologies. The way of collecting and enforcing a tax, as Emmanuel is just emphasizing, is a technology. And what you heard in part from my fellow panelists is a story about an evolution in the technology of taxation from a system that was mostly dependent on collecting things at docks and with stamps on tea to a system of an income tax that relies on withholding and third-party information reporting to make it effective and fair. And so one of the things I'm going to say is, yes, there are a lot of problems that we face, some of them nicely kind of explained by my fellow panelists, but also there are sort of technological solutions. And so I think after what you heard, I probably don't have to say a lot about the current connection between taxation and democracy. Right? In some ways, all you have to do is kind of look around to see the story there. Right? A recent report was 20% of all campaign spending last year was by billionaires. And that's only the tip of the iceberg of the social influence that a billionaire could exert by owning companies they control, supply chains, labor forces, what we see, what we read, what we hear. So campaign finance, potentially a piece of that, but it has to be that the fiscal story is important too, right? And that's in large measure, I think, what Vanessa was talking about, right? Where the wealthy want to control democratic outcomes, not only for their own sake, right, to exert power, but also to protect their wealth. And those two things are kind of mutually reinforcing. And so what tax technologies are available to us to address those kinds of problems? Right? And we have the difficulty, as Ray described, that in the existing tax technology that we've been using, the income tax and the estate tax, right, there are important holes that we haven't been able to fill readily. Because of information limitations, traditionally we said we only tax gains by investors at the time when they sell that property, at least in the United States. And then some countries also try to do it, I'll argue unsuccessfully, when people die. And so you can raise your rates as high as you want on investment income, and probably you're not going to bring in that much money, because the more you raise the rates, the less people will sell their investments, essentially. Give people a choice about when to pay, and one of those options is never, they're going to pick never. So the obstacles, right, to successfully taxing the wealthy at the federal level are this kind of technological constraint on what you can kind of know about what stuff was worth. And also at the federal level, there's this legal limitation you heard about, where the US Supreme Court seems to want to say we can only tax investments at the time of sale. No, the alternative is to try to achieve some policy goals at the state level, where you don't have that federal constitutional constraint in the United States, but you might have the additional practical question about, well, is that money going to move before you can tax it? And so what I want to say is there are possible tax technological responses. So one solution, for instance, that I proposed in some of my work at the federal level is, sure, wait until people sell when you know what their stuff is worth, and when you're at a moment where the Supreme Court agrees you can tax. But just impose a higher rate of tax on those sales, where the rate that you charge leaves the individual taxpayer with exactly the same money they would have been left with had you been taxing them every year all along as their wealth was growing. Or you could tax them at sale on the amount they would have paid under a wealth tax all along, but you just tax them at sale. And you could give them the choice to pay sooner if they want and give them an incentive to do that. There might be reasons you might prefer that we can talk about later. Similarly, at the state level, there are possible technological solutions where, in our view, my view and Emmanuel's as well, I think, the evidence is that there isn't a lot of real mobility response to efforts to tax at the subnational level, at least in places like Spain and Switzerland. That's the evidence. There is a fair amount of evidence that people kind of try to fudge where they say that they live, We're seeing some of that already in response to the California tax, right? You see these news stories, oh, this person bought a new house in Florida. Guess what? It's their 7th house. I don't think that story tells us anything about where they're actually a tax resident. So the key point there is when real responses aren't that substantial, most of the response is a reporting response, is a response that's a claim about where someone legally resides. Those are the kinds of responses where you can design a legal system to respond. You can make it harder for people to claim that they've shifted their income. You can make it harder for people to claim that their pied-à-terre or their ski chalet in Tahoe is really their residence. And there's a variety of ways that you could design a tax system to get at that. I don't want to take too much more time because I'd love to get to our Q&A. But what I want to say is, not that lawyers have the answer to everything, but given the state of the evidence, it seems like the law as a technology has some substantial contribution it could make on all these fronts.
So there's so much to dig into here, but I actually kind of want to step back and just talk about why it even makes sense to discuss taxes at all. Taxes are not the only way to redistribute wealth. There are many others. I've in mind things like expanding rights and protections for workers, capping CEO compensation, strengthening antitrust law, which would reduce the chance of anyone becoming that wealthy in the first place, such that they would then have to redistribute it. So what makes taxation worth focusing on in particular relative to these other things? And can we think of it as a sort of first best solution to addressing inequality, or is it the thing you do when other things have already gone wrong?
I can say a few words on this one. I mean, taxes will always be with us just because they are very big in any, advanced economies, So in the United States, taxes relative to total income produced is about 30%. If you add taxes, from all levels of government. In Europe, it's 50%, in a number of countries. So when you have this enormous volume of revenue you are raising, it's normal then there is a fight on how should this tax be apportioned, across individuals. And indeed, you look through the years, there can be dramatic differences in how progressive it is. Regulations are also very important, minimum wage at the bottom, anti-monopoly, antitrust regulation. It's not to dismiss them. But taxes are the tool, any society has to work with, no matter what.
I also think that it is what it means. It's the thing that binds us together as a country. It's the government whatever it is you want your government to do, and there's so many things that we count on our government to do to create a civilized society, and then all of us paying for it is an essential part of that. If you want to have government, you need to have taxes. And how we apportion those taxes is essential to whether the country is doing what it needs to be doing. Because if we don't apportion them in some fair fashion, then it undermines the legitimacy of the whole system.
So I think pre-distribution and redistribution are complementary. They're not competitive. It is easier to pre-distribute when there isn't a massive accumulation of wealth at the very top that's going to make it harder politically to achieve pre-distribution. Right? When you have better pre-distribution, there's less for the tax system to have to accomplish through redistribution. So I think that these are policies to work together. And fundamentally, even if you believed everything should be accomplished through pre-distribution, the fact is we're a highly, highly unequal society today, so it's too late to pre-distribute.
I mean, right. So what's unique about taxes is not their capacity to achieve redistribution. We've redistributed in this country in many different ways. The largest redistributions in our history are certainly the defense of slavery, emancipation, and the expropriation of the native nations. These are by far larger than anything our tax system does, though of course our tax system does something. But that's not what makes taxes special, is that it's not their redistributive power, right? That it fits in with other economic policies to achieve redistribution. What's unique about taxation is that they are what funds the state. And that's not only how we pay for all the public goods that we want. It is how we fund the actual structure of the government that creates spaces of equality, right? The purpose of our government is not like just a vending machine for public services, though it should be more of a vending machine providing more public services in my view, but the places that are public are places that have an assumption of equality. We don't achieve that equality, but we assert it, and that is something that we do not want to lose. So it's like our sidewalks, it's like our courthouses, it's like our public schools. They're places where you're supposed to be treated as equals, right? You're not supposed to get special treatment when you go to the DMV because you're rich. You're not supposed to be able to bribe the DMV to give you a license. Your boss can't stand behind you when you're voting. We have rules and spaces that we protect from private influence, and that is one of the really central things that government achieves, and we pay for it with taxes. And there's no other way to do it, so, yeah.
Sort of picking up on that theme too, of the spaces of equality, in reading all of your work and then trying to connect the dots with, just current politics, I can't help but notice this sort of historical inversion. There's points in American history, Vanessa, you write about the Reconstruction and then around the turn of the 20th century where, as you said, the rich were subject to greater taxation, but they also made this claim that the government was sort of like a corporation and they were the shareholders in that corporation. And since when did non-shareholders have a say in how the corporation was run, right? And so they would use this to justify why the poor, the propertyless, the non-tax-paying shouldn't participate in public life, basically. What's so curious today is that the people who contribute the least seem to have the most unfettered access to political power. How did that transformation take place? And how did that ever become a legitimate arrangement for a not small portion of the American public? Small question, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, so I almost had a chapter in my book about campaign finance issues, funding for campaign finance, but I'm fundamentally an optimist by nature, and it was just too much of a buzzkill. So this is a big problem. Obviously, we have not. There's plenty of ways of getting what you want. Taxes is not generally one of them, exactly because of what Vanessa says about those are places of equality, and of course, campaign finance is seeking just the opposite, inequality. Yeah.
Historically, last time we saw this sort of resentment of extreme inequality was, the Gilded Age, when we then got the income tax. But it seems like there's still, plenty of obstacles on the road to actually achieving some major transformation in how we currently are approaching taxes in the U.S. So, why haven't we gotten to this major turning point here? And what happens if we don't actually transform how we're approaching taxes and the tax burdens we put on the super rich?
I can jump in on that for
Yep.
a second. Because the Supreme Court declared, we had an income tax in the United States during the Civil War. It helped the Union win the war. There's a Confederate general who once said, we weren't whipped on the battlefield, we were whipped in the Treasury Department. And there's something real to that, right? The southern states were bad at raising taxes, and to win a war, you have to be good at raising taxes. So we had an income tax in the Civil War. It was allowed to expire after the war. When they tried to re-implement an income tax in 1894, the next year the Supreme Court, a Gilded Age Supreme Court, as we all know, that was about to make decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson and decide that child labor was a-okay, a bunch of great stuff. One of those decisions was that the income tax was unconstitutional. They had declared it constitutional 15 years earlier, no, less. But now it was unconstitutional because of the direct tax clause. And this was one of the compromises with slavery that was in our Constitution that said that anything that was defined as a direct tax, left undefined, unhelpfully by our founders, needed to be apportioned by state, right? So That makes no sense because the amount of money you have in a state and the number of people you have in a state is not actually closely related. And that, so it just made the income tax impracticable. And so then we had to have a 20-year fight to get our income tax amendment, right? Spoiler, we have an income tax now. But getting the income tax did not mean getting those high rates right away. The thing that gave us the high rates was the war, World War I. And the thing that gave us the next set of higher rates, because it came down after the war, was World War II. So it appears to be the case that democracies tax far more progressively when they are in conditions that are like mass warfare. And I haven't checked my phone, but currently I think we are not. But you could argue, whatever. When I'm playing Pollyanna, I like to think that climate change is frankly going to. This is what me being optimistic sounds like. Climate change is creating the conditions that like mass capital destruction, sudden changes in that give people the impression that maybe we need an equality of sacrifice, right? Because that was the argument during war, is that, this is propaganda poster from World War I. They're like, you think that income tax burden is heavy? Well, I'll tell you that a soldier's pack weighs 60 pounds, right? And it was a way of saying, the rich old guys, you got to come on, you're not doing the really hard work that the young guys are doing. It was like a pretty straightforward line of propaganda, right? So maybe there are conditions that are not war that can achieve the level of progressivity that we have seen during war, right? History doesn't tell us everything that's coming, obviously, but it is in those conditions that we have seen that. And it is very clear internationally and in our own history that mass suffrage is not enough to get us to highly progressive tax systems.
Can I add to that? Because that's something else that I also wrote about. And these are reasons maybe to be a little bit concerned about our possibilities of taxing the rich, but I'll try to put a positive spin somewhere, maybe mass annihilation through climate change. That could be good. Okay, so here are two other problems. So definitely, there is a book by Saez and Sheev called Taxing the Rich that looks at 30 states, and basically they say this thing that Vanessa is saying, which is that it's very much tied to people are sending their children off to war, and therefore, and then we expect the rich to give their capital, right? So regular people are sending their children, rich should provide their own service. And one of the things that they argue is that since we no longer have, for example, a draft in this country, right? So since the late 70s, we don't have a draft anymore, so we no longer have conscription of individuals. We have a volunteer army, and we also don't fight wars the same way. We're fighting this war. We've lost 7 American soldiers, right? It's not like putting a lot of people out, and they are concerned. They raise the concern that with this shift of how we fight wars, there's been a reduction of pressure to tax the rich. The other thing, which I mentioned earlier, is the threat of socialism and the threat of communism, which played a very big role in the United States needing to prove that capitalism could serve the people. And these were real threats at the time, but since the early 1980s, and this is Branko Milanović's point and Tony Judt, is that since that time, with the destruction of communism, essentially, like no one's really saying we're going to become a socialist country, we're going to become a communist country, and because of that, capitalism doesn't have to prove itself the way that it has had to in the past. The only thing that I hang on to when I think of the positivity is this idea of pendulums. Pendulums swing in both directions, as we've often seen to great horror in recent times. And I do think that now our richest Americans are no longer, they're no longer showing themselves as finely as perhaps maybe they did when we're like, we're only doing good, or whatever it was that they were arguing about in the early days of tech. We're seeing a lot of very rich Americans across what we thought was across the political spectrum really bending their knee. And so it is possible that this too is going to shift how we think about the rich. So.
Yeah. Agree. Historically, it's difficult to engineer, a substantial change in redistribution. People have talked about wars, but I think it's not just the wars per se. That is, you need wars. They started progressive taxation in the US, and then that gives an example that even countries that didn't go through the wars are going to imitate it. But it's tough. In the US, I do remember around the financial crisis, of 2008 was perhaps the most striking, missed opportunity, because it was a situation where it's clear that finance ran amok, where they had made huge gains, responsible for crashing the economy, then the election of Obama as president, and yet, nothing really happened on the tax front. It's in part, the choice of personnel in the Obama administration, but that was a moment where perhaps it could have happened. So it's not that easy to.
Can I add one sentence about what happened at that time? Right, so we're thinking like, okay, we're going to tax the rich now, right? Because they've pretty much destroyed our economy. Do you notice, anyone know what happened at that time when that a group of the richest Americans, the Forbes 400, had a series of meetings that were led by Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and David Rockefeller, and they came up with the Giving Pledge, where the richest Americans, all of a sudden, and this was in response to a letter saying, we've got to do something. And basically, a whole bunch of the richest Americans said, don't worry about it. We're going to make a non-binding promise to give half of our money to whatever we think is good. And that's what we got instead of taxes in that time.
Right, just to pick up on that point too, I am curious, this is the first mention of philanthropy, I think, today, and I was curious, where does that fit into all of this? There's plenty of examples of people that have signed the Giving Pledge, calling this basically a self-imposed taxation, which is, at least for me, an argument I've never bought, because if it's a taxation, it's an incredibly meager rate. It has basically zero public oversight. And let's see, it avoids paying actual taxes, right? Does the philanthropy actually do the thing that it claims to do? So there's a lot of reasons to not do it. Given the current philanthropic landscape, would we even want to use our tax code to encourage philanthropy, or would we maybe do this differently? And I guess, Brian, I know you have quite some background on this too.
So I definitely have thoughts about that. One of the things to keep in mind, and I know Ray agrees with me on this because we wrote a chapter that says this essentially, is if one of the reasons to have a highly progressive tax system is to limit the influence of the wealthiest over political outcomes, giving tax benefits in order to give someone a venue to achieve their political outcomes, essentially their policy outcomes, seems backwards, especially when the tax benefit you're offering is something upwards of 70 cents on the dollar. Yeah.
Don't get me started on.
Yeah, I know. I realized I was opening a can of worms by even asking that, but here we are. So I wanted to, it seems like we might not have anything, or we might have something cataclysmic happen that will lead to changes in our tax code. But if we don't, I'm curious what the case is for the status quo. Ray has this excellent example in her book that I really paused on, which was, if an Uber driver earns $100,000 from driving for the platform, they're subject to income taxes and payroll taxes that combine to about 30%. If an investor makes $100,000 from their Uber stock, assuming they sell it, they will pay capital gains taxes of 15%. To me, that lays bare that this is a highly unequal system. But what would I have to believe to think that this arrangement is just? And like that. No, I know. This is why I need you to have the fifth panelist, in a sense, that disagrees with the general mode of everyone here.
I was debating the California billionaire tax at Stanford earlier last week, and the argument, is something that recurs, throughout human history. The big guys, the big person, is responsible, for our wealth, and we should be grateful, and we shouldn't, touch them. And it's almost religious, it's like touching the gods, it's a sacrilege, and you are gonna bring upon yourself, calamities. That's more or less, the argument in its essence, but it is a powerful one. in the sense that, yes, lots of human societies are very autocratic, that concentrate power and wealth. And that's in part, how those societies hold.
Practice on actually turning on my mic. It brings up the fact that there are all sorts of arguments that get trotted out whenever there's a proposed increase in taxes on the rich. We've definitely seen this, as I believe Brian mentioned, with the LLCs in Miami and the pied-à-terre in Nevada and things like this. But there's this whole line of arguments, and there's also this whole infrastructure that supports these arguments. That every time there's a proposal, there's then stuff that is brought up. How do you combat that and the disinformation that comes with it? And what is the kind of alternative infrastructure, the pro-tax infrastructure in a sense, that helps kind of counteract those forces?
There's a statistic that you might hear a lot. Anytime there's a proposal for taxes, if you make the mistake to read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages like I do, or even you read any number of places, you might have heard the following statistic. The richest 1% or the top 1%, is always some vague term, pay 40% of the income taxes, and 40% of Americans pay no taxes. Have any of you heard that? I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, right? And that seems to be like, what the hell are you guys talking about? The problem is solved. The richest 1% are paying 1% of all income taxes, and 40% of Americans are paying no income taxes. Okay. But when they are talking about the top 1%, they are talking about those with the most taxable income. And as we know, our richest Americans are not the ones with the most taxable income. Indeed, they are just as likely to be in the 40% of non-payers as they are in the top 1% of payers. And also that percent, the statistic about the 40%, that is only counting income taxes. But as we talked about, payroll taxes are a significant burden on Americans. It's a burden that is 15.3% carried entirely by people who are self-employed. And even though people who are employed by others, half is paid by the employer, economists generally agree that the employees are paying that through lower wages. So it is false on both fronts, but it is very powerful. And the only way I can think to counter it is basically to go running through the streets like Paul Revere, as I'm inclined to do, and say, hey people, or the rich people are avoiding taxes by avoiding taxable income, and hopefully it will get through so that when people say to you, what are you talking about? They're already paying taxes. Or even as Gavin Newsom said, we've got the most progressive income tax in the state, okay? That, as you know, because you've sat here through this and you might have known before, that progressive income taxes in the state, that is not doing anything because you need taxable income in order for those income taxes to mean anything.
I can chime in on that.
Yeah, please do.
Away from our Q&A, I guess the one thing I would say quickly is it's also helpful to have a tax system that tries to tax wealth at a time that it's easy to measure and that seems intuitive to people. So, for example, this is a possible source of mild disagreement with Ray and I, although I don't think ultimately we disagree. Right? Trying to tax people at death might be a moment that strikes some people as counterintuitive or hard to administer. But I think there are ways technologically, right? Instead of taxing at death, tax the heirs when they sell the stuff and charge them interest. Right? So I think you can build a tax system that mitigates some of the kind of standard criticisms, but yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, I'll add one thing. So first of all, in terms of like a pro-tax infrastructure, which I love the idea of, I sort of like you're building, so well done. But obviously one of the challenges, we talked a lot about campaign finance already, but the media infrastructure, I live in Washington, D.C. We had this paper called the Washington Post. It was a really good paper. So, there is also the way that, that creates just enormous problems of informing people about what's happening, right? About the reality of our tax code, for example. But I also think that there's a rhetoric that we have abandoned that you don't hear very much of anymore. And one of the cool things about writing about American history is you get to find out how people in the past talked about things, and sometimes it's different, and sometimes it's something worth remembering. So there's a guy named E.R.A. Seligman, who's, I bet some people in this, I knew that was going to get nods on the panel here, the father of the modern income tax. He was an economist, he was at Columbia University, and at one point he says, he's also a lawyer. So he at one point says that it's now generally agreed that the reason we pay taxes is not because of any benefits we receive, but because the state is a part of us. So the idea that that could ever be that could ever be generally agreed, right? That the government, that our government is our government, right? And that's why you pay for it, because it's for us. It's what we do together, right? That rhetoric has been lost for so long, and I think that's part of what made the last year in Washington, D.C. possible, right? The last year of destroying like major government entities that did and still try to do very, very important things, like tell us when there's going to be a hurricane, or keep track of the nuclear stockpile. A lot of really big tasks because we didn't believe that government does anything, or we didn't believe enough, it made it possible to do a kind of damage that I think would be inconceivable in other times. And so to me, part of building that pro-tax infrastructure is having a full-throated defense of what government is. And not that it has to, that it is perfect. It is made by humans like every other thing, not perfect, but that it is worthwhile and worth defending, and something that we can be proud of, that we can see and say, perhaps one day again it could be generally agreed that it is part of us.
So before we join Ray in running through the streets that the plutocrats are coming, I believe we have audience questions. So you just want to take over? Yeah, great.
Yeah, so we have about a little less than 10 minutes left, so please use the QR code if you have additional questions. So I'm going to try to combine some questions in the interest of time. So one kind of synthetic question here would be to sort of think about the political moment today versus the progressive era in which many of the kind of stars of our tax firmament were initially kind of inaugurated in the United States, and thinking about comparing the moment today to that moment. And so a question about why wasn't the pandemic sort of a war-like event that would have changed our attitudes towards taxes? And then also looking to the rest of the world. So thinking about the Swiss wealth tax referendum from a few months ago that was resoundingly defeated, and then looking ahead to the California billionaire tax proposal. So I'll leave it.
Ready answer here is that it's not just tax systems that develop technologies and that experiment, but it's also individuals who want to prevent themselves from having to pay the tax burdens. So they learn. And one of the things they learned is a good way to shape the public perception of the tax system is to control media institutions and limit the amount of information that people have available about what the actual distribution of the tax burden is. So that's a thing that I think policymakers have to reckon with. I should note, by the way, that the Swiss have a wealth tax, right? So the referendum was not about whether to continue this Swiss wealth tax or not.
Who was it?
Referendum was about an inheritance tax on very large inheritances, above 50 million. It was very popular, in initial polling, and then the polling, went down dramatically, and so it lost resoundingly. So it is a fact, that indeed the billionaires have a lot of influence, through the press. We see it with the California billionaire tax. Probably, a lot of the articles you're reading or more, of the Stanford type story, and so we'll see, so even though people care about inequality, they care about billionaires, paying their fair share. At the end of the day, we have a process, and it's an uphill battle.
Do you know why? I'm curious to know why it didn't. What was the shift that caused the popular to become unpopular?
I think it was, again, mostly mobility stories. Our wealthy folks are all going to leave if they know, such a large inheritance tax awaits them.
And And I do think, by the way, this thing about the leaving, at least on the national level, is a bunch of baloney. I mean, are people really going to give up their US citizenship? And we've seen what it's like when people have moved to other parts of the world thinking they were in tax havens. I think that it's a real, at least on the national level, it is an empty threat.
Yeah, just one quick thing about that. You know, a standard assumption when people do models of whether corporations will respond to kind of tax holidays that they're offered in order to relocate to, you know, to a downtown business district or something. A standard assumption of the model is after the jurisdiction gets you there, they're going to crank up the taxes because now you're there and they have you, you know, in a vulnerable position. So you know, a rational person might not necessarily expect to get a long-term tax benefit from leaving is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So we've got a question here about why is the Democratic Party, perhaps the intuitive party for progressive taxation, relatively timid or even opposed to progressive taxation? Obviously, there's a lot of different folks in the Democratic Party, so I'll leave it kind of open-ended.
The fundamental problem is that there are now three forces, you know, the far right appealing, you know, to people with moderate income, moderate education, and then you have this enormous Democratic Party that represents what used to be, you know, the normal Republican Party, you know, we should pay attention, you know, not scare the wealthy off and so on, and the more progressive, and it's maybe one third, and that big middle, you know, the centrists, perhaps they are not that big in the electorate, but suddenly they are the elites. They have enormous, they have enormous influence.
I also think that there is a certain amount of tax illiteracy that occurs amongst, because our tax system has been the sort of message, oh, our tax system is too complicated to understand, and the rich are always going to find their way. There's all sorts of baloney that's being told about that you can't understand taxes, and I think that it extends to politicians as well. There has not been a clear narrative presented about the problem, and so I think we see a lot of, like, there's been a lot of confusion between the top income earners who really do pay all the taxes and the top wealth owners who don't pay the taxes. And that has been caught up in a convergence of the 1%. And you see that even with politicians too. So I personally think it was a big mistake from Democrats to be like, the problem is people who make $400,000. What it did is it took high income people and who were paying high taxes, and it made them think that they were aligned with the interest of the rich. And I think that was an unfortunate political move.
Add one more thing to that. I think that's important to know is that legislators systematically misperceive their constituents, and there's a lot of political science on this. And one of the ways in which they persistently misperceive their constituents is they imagine them to be more conservative than they are. Republican legislators vastly overestimate the conservativeness of their districts. Democratic legislators also overestimate the conservativeness of their districts, but not to quite such an extreme degree. And the other thing to bear in mind is, I think part of the mechanism by which people are misunderstanding their constituencies is that they hear most from well-off people. And they hear, there's of course a ton of research on this too, that legislators are more attuned to the attitudes of their donors rather than their just voters. And so all of this, I think, combines to make Democrats in particular more gun-shy on taxes than they should be, because they genuinely do not understand that the attitudes of the anti-tax politics that has dominated the last 40 years is not actually a particularly good representation of the attitudes of average Americans, and so they misunderstand what's possible in that way. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we're almost at time, so this will have to be the final question. So we have a few questions about kind of political activism, and sort of how would you sort of pitch, give an elevator pitch for the California wealth tax as sort of in conjunction with sort of how do we help fight for a better tax system? assuming indeed that those two are related?
California looks like it has a progressive income tax. As Ray said, it's actually not. And the billionaires in California don't actually pay anything close to a fair share of their economic income. So if you want a fairer California fiscal system, and if you want to fill the $100 billion or so budget hole that's going to result from federal cuts in July to healthcare spending in California, this is the most promising avenue yet.
Thank you all so much for this wonderful panel. So please join me in a round of applause.